Hey guys, tonight we begin with the stark, relentless, and often utterly miserable truth of life during the Dark Ages. Forget the romanticized tales of chivalrous knights and grand castles. The reality for the vast majority was a constant battle for survival against disease, famine, and ceaseless danger. It was an era where simply existing was an extraordinary feat. So, before we dive into the true history of this challenging period, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a joy to see how many people from around the world are ready for this journey. Now, dim the lights, close your eyes, feel your body deeply relax, leaving the tiring day behind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine bustling marketplaces and heroic sagas. The truth is, for the average person, it was a daily grind of hard labor and profound uncertainty, where the threat of starvation or illness was a constant shadow. It wasn't just a tough time, it was a fundamental redefinition of human endurance. Picture this. You've just woken up to the biting cold of a muddy, straw-thatched hut. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. Your bed is a thin layer of straw, shared with fleas and other unseen creatures. The internal temperature of your home is barely warmer than the frigid outside, offering little respite from the bone-chilling dampness that seeps into your very bones. Every morning is a test of will, just to rise from your primitive resting place. And then, the day truly begins. Outside, the world is a tapestry of endless manual labor and the ever-present threat of violence or disease, making each sunrise a quiet prayer for survival until the next. As the grand light of the Roman Empire slowly dimmed, a profound shadow began to stretch across the vast expanse of Europe, gently ushering in an era of deep transformation and relentless, quiet challenge. This period, often called the Dark Ages, was not a sudden dramatic collapse, but rather a long, slow process of decay, a gradual unraveling of the intricate, sophisticated structures that had once defined an entire civilization. Imagine, if you will, the very paths you might have walked. The once proud Roman roads, engineering marvels of their time, were now crumbling remnants of a forgotten glory, overgrown with tenacious weeds and consumed by the unchecked wild. Their smooth, well-paved surfaces became cracked, uneven, and perilous, no longer meticulously maintained. Consider the vital arteries of Roman life, the grand aqueducts that once channeled fresh, clean water to bustling urban centers. These monumental structures, now silent and broken, stood as stark, stoic monuments to a past that felt impossibly distant, a time of comfort and order that had simply vanished. Many of the great cities themselves, once vibrant hubs of commerce, culture, and robust governance, dwindled into mere shadows of their former selves. Their populations shrank dramatically, their magnificent buildings either repurposed for humbler needs or left to slowly, inexorably crumble, stone by agonizing stone, their materials scavenged by those desperate for basic shelter. The intricate networks of trade and communication that once knit the vast Roman world together largely disintegrated. In their place arose isolated, often suspicious, self-sufficient communities. The very act of travel became an arduous, deeply perilous undertaking, fraught with a myriad of dangers. Bandits lurked in the overgrown forests, wild animals roamed more freely, and the sheer unforgiving nature of unkempt roads and broken bridges made any journey a gamble with fate. A profound sense of isolation began to settle over the land, a feeling that your tiny corner of the world was all that truly existed, disconnected from any larger tapestry of civilization. This was a world where central authority, once so encompassing and predictable, had shattered into countless smaller fragmented pieces. Where a unified empire once stood, now there were numerous petty kings, ambitious local lords, and powerful tribal chieftains, each fiercely vying for dominance and control. Their shifting borders were as unpredictable as sand dunes in a desert wind. This deep fragmentation meant a constant gnawing state of insecurity, a pervasive uncertainty about who truly held power, who could be trusted, and from where the next wave of conflict or devastation might suddenly emerge to sweep through your unsuspecting village. Law, as we might recognize it today, was often deeply localized and distressingly arbitrary, its application dependent more on the immediate whim of the nearest strongman than on any codified, universally understood system of justice. The common person had little recourse, few avenues for justice beyond the local lord's decree. In this reimagined world, the comfortable and expansive sense of community that once characterized Roman life narrowed dramatically. Your entire universe might have shrunk to the confines of your village, the familiar faces of your family, and the often demanding presence of your immediate lord. The grand, sweeping narratives of empire and civilization were replaced by the intensely personal daily struggle for sheer existence within a tightly bound, often insular and suspicious local sphere. Imagine the quiet fear of the unknown, the whispers of distant raiders, the anxiety over whether a neighboring lord would decide to expand his territory at your community's expense. Every rustle in the woods, every stranger on the horizon could signal danger. Intellectual innovation, and indeed progress in many forms, slowed to a crawl. Not because the people of this era were inherently less intelligent, but because the sophisticated societal structures, the patronage and the widespread infrastructure that once supported broad learning, scientific inquiry, and artistic development had largely vanished. Knowledge, precious and rare, became a guarded treasure, frequently confined to the dwindling, isolated monasteries. Here, devoted monks meticulously copied and recopied ancient texts, performing an invaluable service in preserving mere fragments of a fading intellectual heritage for future generations. For the vast majority, education beyond practical skills for survival was simply non-existent. Picture the once cultivated lands, once meticulously managed by Roman agriculture, now slowly being reclaimed by vast, untamed forests, their wildness pressing in ever closer on human settlements. The natural world reasserted its dominance, a constant, tangible reminder of the powerful, untamed forces of nature. The rhythms of human life became inextricably dictated by the relentless cycle of the seasons, by the unforgiving fertility of the soil, and by the simple, enduring, often brutal cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. There was precious little buffer against the cruel caprices of nature. No extensive, resilient infrastructure existed to mitigate the devastating impact of a failed crop, a devastating flood, or particularly harsh, prolonged winter. Each passing year was a desperate gamble, each hard-won harvest a fragile, temporary victory against the ever-present specter of scarcity and famine. It was a world profoundly and utterly different from our own, stripped bare of the comforting layers of convenience, technology, and security that we now so readily take for granted. It was a time when the very act of existing, of drawing breath each day, was an ongoing exercise in profound resilience where virtually every sunrise brought with it a new, daunting challenge, and where the fading echoes of a grand and powerful past served only to highlight the stark, unrelenting realities of a present moment defined by an unyielding struggle for mere survival. As we gently continue our journey through these distant centuries, let us hold this vivid image firmly in our minds, a world reimagined, not as a glorious, vibrant tapestry of achievement, but as a hard-won, often bleak landscape, intricately defined by human endurance and a quiet, unyielding struggle against overwhelming odds. From the wide, sweeping view of a broken world, let us now gently narrow our focus, peering into the very hearth of daily life, into the most fundamental, unyielding struggle of all, the relentless pursuit of sustenance. In an era where the intricate systems of the past had crumbled, every single day presented a stark, often terrifying question: how would you feed yourself and your loved ones? This was not a matter of choice or preference, but a raw biological imperative, dictating the very rhythm and anxieties of existence. Imagine, if you will, waking each morning with a subtle, persistent ache in your stomach, a feeling of emptiness that was less an occasional hunger pang and more a constant, familiar companion. For the vast majority during the Dark Ages, food was not a plentiful commodity, nor a source of culinary delight. It was a meager, hard-won prize, secured through backbreaking labor and constant vigilance, often barely enough to stave off the gnawing pangs of starvation. The fields around your small, isolated village were your lifeline. Here, under the unforgiving sun or through chilling rain, you would toil from dawn until dusk, with tools that seem impossibly primitive to our modern eyes. Picture a wooden plow, perhaps tipped with a small iron share, clumsily drawn by oxen whose strength was often barely sufficient for the heavy, unyielding earth. There were no sophisticated machines, no tractors, no scientific fertilizers to enhance the soil's bounty. It was pure, unadulterated human and animal muscle, guided by generations of inherited, often inefficient wisdom. The yields from these fields were tragically low. A single bad harvest, perhaps due to a prolonged drought or incessant rains, a sudden pestilence, or even just the exhausted state of the soil itself could spell utter disaster. It was a delicate, precarious balance where the success of your entire year, indeed your very survival, hinged upon the unpredictable whims of nature and the meager fruits of your relentless effort. The concept of surplus, of storing enough food for lean years, was often a luxury, a distant dream for most. This constant vulnerability meant that the specter of famine was not a historical anecdote, but a recurring, terrifying reality. Entire communities could be wiped out by crop failures, forcing people to desperate measures. We hear tales of roots and bark, of desperate foraging in the wild, of the agonizing choices made when bellies remained stubbornly empty. Malnutrition was widespread, a silent thief that stole strength, dulled minds, and made populations incredibly susceptible to every passing illness. Children, especially, bore the brunt of this scarcity, many never reaching adulthood due to insufficient nourishment. Food preparation itself was a rudimentary affair, constrained by the limited resources available. Think of coarse grains, barley, rye, or oats, ground laboriously by hand into flour, which would then be turned into simple, often tough, flatbreads or thick, unappetizing gruels. Vegetables were mostly root crops or hardy greens that could survive the meager growing seasons. Meat, when it was available, was a rare treat for most common folk, usually coming from hunted wild animals, or, more commonly, a pig raised with immense effort and kept for special occasions or necessity. Storage was equally challenging. Without refrigeration, without proper sealed containers, food had to be preserved through drying, salting, or fermentation, all methods that offered limited protection against spoilage, insects, and rodents. A stored sack of grain could easily be lost to dampness or vermin, further diminishing an already precious supply. Imagine the constant worry, the meticulous rationing of every morsel, knowing that a single mistake or misfortune could lead to hunger, sickness, or worse. This wasn't just a physical struggle, it was a profound psychological burden. The constant anxiety over the next meal, the next harvest, the next long winter, seeped into every aspect of life. There was little room for carefree joy when your very existence hung by such a slender thread of sustenance. Yet, within this hardship, communities often found ways to share, to support each other in the silent battle against hunger. Their survival, a testament to their enduring, quiet strength in the face of such overwhelming odds. Now, let us allow this image of relentless provision to gently settle as we slowly drift towards another aspect of this daily grind. As the deep, gnawing anxieties of sustenance begin to gently recede, let us now turn our quiet contemplation to another fundamental aspect of daily life in the Dark Ages, the primitive shelters and coarse clothing that offered the only meager protection against the relentless elements. Imagine for a moment the very concept of home. For most, it was not the sanctuary of warmth and comfort we associate with it today, but rather a constant, tireless battle against the cold, the wet, and the unseen inhabitants that shared their most intimate spaces. Picture yourself stepping into a typical dwelling of this era. It was likely a simple, unassuming hut, constructed from readily available materials, a framework of sturdy wooden posts, walls woven from interwoven branches and twigs, known as wattle, then heavily daubed with a thick mixture of mud, clay, and straw. This humble construction, while functional, offered little in the way of true insulation. The thick, damp earth formed the floor, a constant, cool presence beneath your feet, often turning to mud during prolonged rains or thaws. The roof, crucial for protection, was almost universally thatched with layers upon layers of straw, reeds, or heather. While effective at shedding rain, thatch was a haven for vermin. Mice, rats, and various insects would find refuge within its layers, often making their way into the living space below. The interior of these huts would have been perpetually dim, with light primarily entering through the doorway or perhaps a small, unglazed opening in the wall, covered only by a hide or a wooden shutter, offering little protection from the biting winds or the pouring rain. True windows, as we understand them, were a luxury almost unheard of. There was no central heating, no comforting fireplace drawing smoke efficiently away. Instead, a simple hearth, often just a shallow pit in the center of the earthen floor, provided the sole source of heat. The smoke, heavy and acrid, would rise sluggishly, eventually finding its way out through a small hole in the roof, or more often, simply permeating the entire dwelling, coating everything with soot and stinging the eyes and lungs of its inhabitants. Imagine living year-round in this environment, the pervasive chill of winter seeping into every corner, the dampness clinging to every surface, and the ever-present smell of smoke, wet earth, and unwashed bodies. The battle against the elements was constant. In winter, the cold was a relentless adversary, leading to frostbite, respiratory illnesses, and a constant, draining expenditure of precious bodily energy just to stay warm. In summer, the heat could be stifling, and the very structure that offered shelter could feel like a stifling oven. Sleep would have been a fitful affair, often disturbed by the cold, the damp, or the rustlings of unseen creatures sharing your straw bed. Personal hygiene, too, was a challenge. Access to clean water was limited, and washing clothes or bodies thoroughly was a rare and laborious task, contributing to a cycle of discomfort and the spread of skin ailments. And what of the clothing that adorned these resilient individuals? It was as practical and unadorned as their shelters. The vast majority wore simple garments crafted from coarse wool or linen, spun and woven by hand within their own homes or communities. These fabrics, often undyed or colored with natural earthy tones, offered basic coverage and minimal warmth. Layering would have been essential, with tunics, cloaks, and perhaps trousers or leggings forming the core of an outfit. Picture the texture against your skin, rough, perhaps itchy wool, providing protection but rarely comfort. Clothing was rarely washed, not merely due to a lack of soap or clean water, but because the labor involved was immense, and the need for warmth and protection often outweighed the desire for cleanliness. These garments would accumulate dirt, grime, and the smells of daily life and labor, offering little personal solace or luxury. The simple cloak, often made of heavy wool, was an indispensable item, serving as a blanket by night and protection from rain and cold by day. Footwear was rudimentary, if present at all. Many would have gone barefoot, especially in warmer months, or worn simple leather shoes or wrapped cloths, offering scant protection from the rough terrain, the mud, or the freezing ground. Imagine the constant ache in your feet after a long day of labor, exposed to the elements. This combination of basic, ill-equipped shelter and coarse, infrequently cleaned clothing meant that the body was in an almost constant state of discomfort. The concept of being truly warm, dry, or clean was likely a rare and fleeting sensation, a luxury reserved perhaps for the very highest echelons of society, or for the brief moments by a roaring fire after an exhausting day. For most, existence was a perpetual negotiation with the physical world, a testament to the sheer human capacity to endure relentless physical hardship, finding resilience in the face of what we would now consider unimaginable living conditions. Let us now allow these tactile and sensory images of rudimentary shelter and simple clothing to gently fade as we prepare to explore an even more pervasive and terrifying aspect of life during this distant age, the omnipresence of disease and the profound fragility of existence. As the discomforts of primitive shelter and coarse clothing slowly recede into the backdrop of our minds, a far more insidious and pervasive threat emerges from the shadows of the Dark Ages, the omnipresence of disease, and with it, a profound and undeniable fragility of life itself. Imagine a world where every cough, every fever, every minor cut carried with it a terrifying potential for swift, unyielding devastation. This wasn't merely a fear. It was the chilling daily reality for almost everyone, a relentless current beneath the surface of everyday existence, quietly shaping every decision and every anxious thought. Life expectancy, by modern standards, was tragically brief, often hovering around 30 to 40 years for those who even managed to survive the perils of infancy. For many, simply reaching adulthood was an extraordinary feat, a testament to sheer luck, an exceptionally robust constitution, or perhaps the blessings of a higher power. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high. A heartbreaking number of babies would not live past their first year, succumbing to illnesses that are now easily preventable or curable with a simple vaccine or a course of antibiotics. And tragically, many mothers, too, perished during or shortly after childbirth, often from infections, hemorrhage, or the sheer exhaustion of a prolonged and unassisted labor. This constant, heartbreaking loss was woven into the very fabric of existence, a silent sorrow that touched every family, every community, leaving deep, unhealed emotional scars. There was little understanding of why these tragedies occurred, only the grim acceptance of what felt like an inevitable and cruel fate. The cycle of life and death was brutally swift, stripping away loved ones with alarming regularity, making every new birth a mixture of hope and profound apprehension. Common ailments, which we now easily treat or prevent with readily available medication and hygienic practices, were often fatal scourges. Dysentery, a brutal infection of the intestines causing severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and rapid dehydration, would sweep through communities with terrifying speed, especially in areas with poor sanitation and contaminated water sources, dehydrating and weakening its victims until they simply faded away. Smallpox, a highly contagious and often deadly viral disease, left its survivors disfigured with deep scars and sometimes blind, a visible, lifelong mark of its passage. Influenza, or what we would now simply call the flu, was not a mild seasonal inconvenience that passes after a few days, but a potentially lethal illness that could rapidly overwhelm a body already weakened by malnutrition, constant physical labor, and the ever-present cold and damp. Without any concept of germ theory, the fundamental understanding that microscopic organisms cause disease, people had no idea how these illnesses spread, how to prevent them, or how to effectively treat them. They simply appeared, seemingly from nowhere, and wrought havoc, leaving a trail of suffering and death in their wake, profoundly shaping the collective psyche with an almost spiritual dread. In this world of pervasive illness, the practice of medicine was vastly different from anything we recognize today. There were no sophisticated hospitals with sterile environments, no advanced diagnostic tools like X-rays, no deep understanding of human anatomy or physiology as a modern doctor would possess. Instead, healing practices were a blend of inherited herbal knowledge, deeply held folk magic and charms, and often crude, desperate, and sometimes even actively harmful interventions. The local wise woman, the village elder, or perhaps a monastic healer, often the primary caregivers, might offer remedies passed down through generations, poultices of wild-grown herbs for wounds, infusions from specific plants for fevers, or specific rituals and incantations believed to ward off evil spirits, which were frequently thought to be the ultimate cause of sickness and misfortune. Bloodletting, for instance, was a widely accepted treatment for a vast array of conditions, from fevers and headaches to more complex internal ailments, and even mental illness. The underlying belief was that by removing bad humors, or excess blood, the body could regain its natural balance and expel the illness. This often involved cutting a vein or applying leeches to draw blood, a procedure that, far from curing, frequently weakened an already sick individual, and crucially, introduced the very real danger of infection in an era entirely devoid of antiseptic practices. Imagine for a moment being desperately ill, weakened by fever, pain, and hunger, and having a bladed instrument used on you, or leeches placed upon your skin, all in the sincere but tragically misguided belief that it would bring you relief and recovery. The cure was often as terrifying, if not more so, than the ailment itself, a desperate gamble with one's own fragile life force. Other treatments were equally rudimentary and often brutal. A broken bone might be crudely splinted with rough pieces of wood and tied with strips of cloth, often setting imperfectly, leading to lifelong disability, chronic pain, or permanent limp. Wounds, even minor ones like cuts or abrasions from daily work, could easily fester and lead to agonizing infections, as the basic principles of cleanliness and sterilization were completely unknown. Amputations, when performed for severe injuries or gangrene, were incredibly brutal procedures, done without any form of effective anesthetic, relying only on strong drink or a swift, painful cut, and with a terrifyingly high risk of death from shock, massive blood loss, or subsequent inevitable infection. Survival often came down to sheer, improbable resilience and an immense stroke of luck, rather than any genuinely effective medical intervention or proper path to recovery. This environment of constant illness and rudimentary care meant that many everyday physical conditions that we now take for granted were chronic, debilitating struggles that lasted a lifetime. Poor vision went uncorrected, often making fine motor skills, reading, or even safe movement difficult and dangerous. Aching teeth, often rotting from poor diet and lack of hygiene, caused relentless pain and led to dangerous infections that could spread throughout the body, all without the possibility of a simple dental visit or pain relief. Chronic pain from old injuries, the stiffness of arthritis from years of hard labor and unforgiving conditions, or persistent back strain was simply a part of life, endured with grim stoicism and no expectation of relief. A constant, low-level torment that wore down both body and spirit. Recovery, even from minor ailments, was often slow, incomplete, and always uncertain. The psychological toll of living in such a world where death could strike suddenly and mysteriously from an invisible enemy was immense. There was a constant underlying hum of anxiety, a quiet dread that at any moment you or someone you loved could be taken by an unseen foe, leaving behind a void that was quickly filled with more uncertainty. Without scientific explanation for sickness and death, illness was often attributed to divine punishment for sins, evil curses cast by malicious individuals or malevolent spirits, adding a profound layer of fear, guilt, and superstition to the already immense physical suffering. Praying for healing, making offerings to saints, or seeking the intervention of the church or local holy figures were often the only perceived avenues for hope and solace in the face of such overwhelming, incomprehensible odds, a desperate plea in a world that offered little certainty. So, as we contemplate this deeply challenging aspect of Dark Age existence, allow the image of this relentless vulnerability to settle softly in your thoughts. A world where life was a precious, fragile flame, constantly flickering against the harsh winds of unseen maladies, and where the human spirit was tested daily by the sheer, unyielding reality of bodily suffering. This pervasive fragility, this constant dance with the specter of illness and death, forms a crucial part of understanding why life in this distant era was an experience defined by such profound, unrelenting hardship. Let us now gently prepare to understand an even more terrifying, large-scale dimension of these health challenges as we move from individual suffering to the catastrophic societal impact of widespread plagues and recurring local epidemics. While the individual struggles against everyday ailments were a constant burden, the Dark Ages also faced far greater, more terrifying adversaries, the relentless, sweeping currents of larger outbreaks and devastating plagues. These were not mere illnesses affecting a few. They were forces that could, and often did, reshape societies, leaving behind a profound legacy of death, fear, and shattered communities. Consider, for instance, the chilling memory of the Justinianic Plague, which began its terrifying journey across the known world in the mid-6th century. This was not a localized sickness, but a global catastrophe, a relentless tide of contagion that swept through empires and villages alike, leaving an unimaginable trail of devastation in its wake. Imagine entire cities, once bustling with life and commerce, falling eerily silent as the plague tightened its grip. The very air would become heavy with dread, the streets emptied of all but the sick and the dying, and the sounds of life replaced by the mournful tolling of church bells and the quiet, desperate prayers of the few still untouched. This particular plague, and countless other recurring local epidemics that followed, caused a societal breakdown of unprecedented scale. The foundational pillars of community, family bonds, economic activity, and even religious institutions, were deeply strained, often fracturing under the immense pressure of widespread death. Farmers perished in their fields, leaving crops to rot and hastening the onset of famine. Merchants died in their homes, bringing trade to a standstill. Those who survived often found themselves in a world fundamentally altered, a world where the familiar faces of neighbors and loved ones had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence and a pervasive sense of loss. The lack of any scientific understanding of disease made these outbreaks even more terrifying. Without knowledge of how germs spread or how to prevent infection, people were utterly helpless, caught in a terrifying game of chance with an invisible enemy. The simplest acts, a shared meal, a comforting touch, could carry a deadly risk, fostering a deep-seated paranoia and mistrust. The air itself seemed to carry death, a constant unseen presence that could strike anyone at any time, without warning or mercy. In the absence of scientific explanation, these devastating plagues were often interpreted through the lens of divine wrath, a punishment from an angry god, or the malevolent work of demons and dark magic. This added an immense layer of psychological trauma to the physical suffering. Imagine living with the constant dread that your community might be next, that the strange illness affecting a distant village could soon arrive at your own doorstep, carrying with it not just physical torment, but also the terrifying implication of divine displeasure. The fear was palpable, a cold hand gripping the hearts of everyone, young and old, rich and poor. It was a fear that seeped into dreams, haunted waking hours, and shaped the very understanding of life and death. The psychological impact of these recurring catastrophes was profound and enduring. Even after an outbreak subsided, the collective memory of death and suffering lingered like a persistent shadow. Survivors carried with them not only the scars of physical illness, but also the deep, unhealed wounds of grief, trauma, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. How could one plan for the future when an invisible force could, at any moment, decimate your family, your village, your entire world? This constant existential dread, this awareness of life's extreme fragility in the face of such overwhelming forces, became an intrinsic part of the Dark Age experience, a quiet, underlying current that informed every aspect of human endeavor and emotion. Beyond the immediate loss of life, these epidemics had ripple effects that profoundly altered the course of history and the fabric of daily existence. Imagine a small farming community, already barely self-sufficient. When a plague struck, it wouldn't just take a few individuals. It might claim the lives of the most able-bodied men and women, those whose labor was absolutely vital for planting, harvesting, and tending livestock. Without enough hands to work the land, fields would lie fallow, essential crops would rot, and the fragile food supply would dwindle even further. This created a vicious cycle. Plague led to famine, and famine, in turn, weakened the population, making them even more susceptible to the next wave of disease. The very infrastructure of life began to fray. Roads, already in disrepair, became even less traveled. Bridges, already crumbling, went unrepaired. News and vital information, which moved slowly at the best of times, ground to a halt, isolating communities even further. The sense of being utterly alone in the face of disaster was profound. There was no widespread governmental support, no coordinated public health response, no scientific body to research and combat the spreading maladies. Each village, each family, was left to confront the horror largely on its own, relying on folk remedies, desperate prayers, and the dwindling hope of a few survivors. The impact extended even to the spiritual realm. While the church offered solace and explanations in a world devoid of scientific understanding, the sheer scale of death sometimes challenged even the deepest faith. Why would a benevolent God allow such suffering? These were unanswerable questions that fueled not only devotion, but also a profound, unsettling skepticism, and sometimes even a desperate turn towards more ancient pagan superstitions, a return to seeking protection from elemental spirits or forgotten deities. The line between faith and fear blurred, and religious practices often became intertwined with frantic attempts to appease perceived supernatural forces or to ward off ill omens. Children, if they survived infancy, grew up in a world marked by this omnipresent threat. They would have witnessed profound loss from a young age, understanding implicitly that life was short, fragile, and deeply uncertain. The games they played, the stories they heard, the very structure of their upbringing would have been permeated by the realities of illness and death. There was little space for the carefree innocence we might associate with childhood today. Instead, survival, responsibility, and an early confrontation with mortality defined their formative years. The resilience required was not just for adults, but for every living soul who navigated these perilous times. Even the concept of death itself was altered. With so many dying, with such speed and horror, the rituals of mourning and burial often became rushed and inadequate, driven by necessity and the fear of further contagion, rather than by reverence or tradition. Mass graves were common, and the dignity afforded to the deceased in more stable times was often a luxury that could not be afforded. This further stripped away the comforting social structures surrounding loss, leaving survivors with an even deeper sense of unsettling chaos and disrespect for the natural order of life and death. The air of melancholy that permeated the era was not merely philosophical. It was a direct, palpable consequence of living so intimately with death. The disruption caused by these great plagues extended to the most basic functions of society. Schools, if they even existed in rudimentary form, would close. Markets, already fragile, would cease to operate. The few literate individuals, often within monasteries, might themselves fall victim, further threatening the already precarious preservation of knowledge. Imagine the silent roads, the abandoned workshops, the fields left untended, all bearing witness to the swift, silent passage of death. This was a world where the very act of commerce and social gathering became a dangerous gamble, forcing a retreat into even greater isolation and self-sufficiency for those who remained. The spiritual and emotional desperation of the people was immense. In a world with no scientific answers, the divine became both a source of comfort and a source of terror. Prayers were fervent. Mass ceremonies were held in desperate attempts to appease a perceived angry deity, and penitential processions filled the streets as communities sought to atone for sins they believed had brought such devastation upon them. Yet, even as they sought divine intervention, the death toll continued to climb, leading to profound existential crises and a questioning of faith for some, while for others, it solidified their belief in a powerful, inscrutable, and often wrathful God. The very landscape of memory and tradition was reshaped by these events. Genealogies were severed, family histories lost, as entire lineages disappeared. Skills and knowledge, passed down orally from generation to generation, were suddenly broken as the bearers of that knowledge succumbed. This meant that the collective learning of a community could be reset, forcing survivors to relearn or rediscover basic techniques essential for survival. It was a constant rebuilding, not just of physical structures, but of the very human infrastructure of knowledge and memory, all under the shadow of past and potential future outbreaks. The recurring nature of these local epidemics meant that communities never truly recovered a sense of stable well-being before the next threat emerged. It was a cycle of healing and relapse, of rebuilding and redevastating that profoundly stunted long-term growth and prosperity. The energy and resources that might have been directed towards innovation or cultural advancement were instead perpetually diverted to the immediate, desperate needs of survival, mourning, and recovery. This constant state of emergency, this perpetual dance with the specter of mass death, etched itself deep into the collective consciousness, fostering a worldview dominated by caution, fatalism, and a profound appreciation for any fleeting moment of peace or good health. So, let us allow this solemn understanding of widespread disease and societal vulnerability to gently envelop our thoughts. It serves as a stark, quiet reminder of the immense, almost unimaginable pressures faced by those who lived during the Dark Ages. It paints a picture of a world where not only individual bodies, but entire communities and the very fabric of human connection were constantly under siege by invisible, relentless forces of illness, demanding a level of resilience and a quiet, daily courage that we, in our modern world, can scarcely begin to comprehend. This profound experience of collective suffering and the enduring human spirit in its face continues to resonate, a quiet echo across the centuries, as we continue our immersive journey into these distant, challenging times. As the silent, invisible threats of disease and famine painted a grim landscape across the Dark Ages, a different, more visible shadow also loomed large, a terrifying and relentless force that could shatter lives and communities in an instant, the shadow of the sword. In this distant era, the very idea of security, of being truly safe within your home or village, was a fragile illusion, often brutally dispelled by the sudden, terrifying arrival of external invaders. Imagine for a moment living in a small, peaceful settlement nestled along a quiet coastline or beside a meandering river. Life, though hard, followed predictable rhythms, the turning of the seasons, the labor in the fields, the shared moments of community, the simple joys of family. But then, one clear morning, a sight on the horizon would send a jolt of ice through every heart. The distinct, menacing silhouettes of longships, their dragon prows cutting through the waves, signaling the arrival of the Vikings. The sleek, shallow-drafted vessels were designed for speed and stealth, allowing them to appear with shocking suddenness, often before any effective alarm could be raised. These were not romanticized adventurers of lore. For the people of the Dark Ages, the Vikings were a sudden, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable force of nature. Their raids were characterized by a terrifying swiftness and a shocking intensity. They would strike without warning, landing on undefended shores, or rowing deep inland along rivers, their warriors pouring forth, their intent clear, to plunder precious metals, seize livestock, capture people for enslavement, and to destroy anything that stood in their path. Imagine the sheer, raw terror as the cries of warning echoed through your village, the frantic scramble to hide or flee, knowing that within moments your peaceful existence could be irrevocably shattered, your loved ones imperiled, your meager possessions lost forever. Coastal and riverine communities bore the brunt of these devastating attacks. Their very proximity to water, which had once been a source of sustenance and connection, now made them fatally vulnerable. Monasteries, often rich in treasures, gold, silver, illuminated manuscripts, and almost invariably undefended, were particularly favored targets. Imagine the monks, devoted to prayer and scholarship, living lives of quiet contemplation, suddenly facing a storm of unspeakable violence, their sacred texts burned, their precious relics stolen or desecrated, their very lives brutally ended, their communal life utterly destroyed. The churches, once symbols of faith and solace, could offer no physical protection against these relentless incursions, their stone walls offering little more than temporary barriers against determined attackers. The impact of these raids was not merely physical destruction or the immediate loss of life. Beyond the burning of homes, the widespread death, and the theft of hard-won possessions, there was the pervasive, deep psychological wound of fear that settled over entire regions. This wasn't an abstract fear that could be easily dismissed. It was a tangible, ever-present dread that gnawed at the edges of daily life. Every distant sail on the horizon, every unfamiliar boat on the river, every unusual sound carried the potential to trigger a fresh wave of panic, sending villagers scattering into the surrounding forests or desperately seeking refuge in the nearest fortified enclosure, if one even existed. How could one sleep soundly at night, knowing that at any moment the peace could be shattered by the sudden, terrifying sound of shouting, the clash of steel, and the screams of the innocent? Communities lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, a constant, low-level anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily life. They built rudimentary watchtowers on high ground. They developed crude warning systems involving bonfires or horns. They prayed for divine protection with fervent desperation, but often their defenses were tragically meager against such determined and well-organized attackers. There was no concept of a large, standing army, no central government with the immense resources to quickly dispatch forces to protect every vulnerable village or isolated farmstead across vast, fragmented territories. Local lords, if present and capable, offered only localized and often unreliable protection, frequently preoccupied with their own territorial disputes, or simply lacking the manpower to effectively repel a full-scale Viking incursion. The idea of a unified defense was a distant memory from the Roman past, replaced by desperate individual efforts. The vulnerability of the common person was profound. With no strong central authority, no reliable system of justice or defense, individuals and small communities were left to fend for themselves. A common person had little recourse, few truly safe places to flee. To abandon your home, your precious fields, your ancestral lands meant inviting starvation and utter destitution. To stay meant risking everything: your life, your family's lives, your very freedom if you were captured and enslaved. The choices were agonizing, the outcomes often grim, and the odds heavily stacked against survival. This constant external threat meant that the very act of building, of sowing, of creating, of investing any effort into a stable future was done under a thick cloud of uncertainty, a quiet, haunting understanding that all efforts could be undone in a single, brutal day. The very concept of a secure future was profoundly undermined by this pervasive insecurity. Why invest years of backbreaking labor into improving your farm? Why spend precious time and resources building a more substantial home? Why meticulously plan for the next generation if a raiding party could simply sweep through and destroy it all, reducing years of effort to ashes in a matter of hours? This constant, looming threat fostered a deep sense of fatalism, a feeling that one was merely a pawn in a larger, violent game, utterly at the mercy of forces far beyond individual control. It was a life lived on the knife's edge, where moments of peace were always temporary reprieves, and violence an ever-present terrifying possibility, coloring every interaction and every quiet moment of reflection. This era was a stark reminder of humanity's deepest, most primal fears: invasion, utter loss, and the sudden, brutal end of everything familiar and cherished. It fostered a resilience born not of choice, but of sheer, unyielding necessity. And as we let these vivid, somber images of distant, dragon-prowed ships and the echoes of desperate cries for help gently recede, we prepare to understand that the threats to life and limb were not only external, from raiders across the seas, but also deeply rooted within the fragmented, fractured societies of the time. The shadow of the sword was a constant, unwelcome companion, whether cast by foreign invaders or by conflicts much closer to home. As we allow the vivid, somber images of distant, dragon-prowed ships and the echoes of desperate cries for help to gently recede, we turn our attention now to a different, yet equally pervasive, dimension of insecurity. For the people of the Dark Ages, the shadow of the sword was cast not only by foreign invaders from across the seas, but also by conflicts much closer to home, deeply rooted within the fragmented, fractured societies of the time. The grand, unifying structure of the Roman Empire, which had for centuries provided a semblance of law and order, however imperfect, had now utterly dissolved, leaving behind a power vacuum of immense and frightening proportions. This wasn't a tidy transition. It was a slow, chaotic, and often violent disintegration, a steady unraveling of the very threads that had once held society together. Imagine a tapestry, once whole and magnificent, now torn into countless pieces, each fragment claiming to be a complete picture. This was the political landscape of post-Roman Europe. Without a central emperor or a unified legal system to enforce peace and administer justice across vast territories, power became intensely localized. In its place arose a multitude of petty kings, ambitious local lords, and powerful strongmen, each carving out their own small domains, their territories often shifting and violently contested. These lords, eager to expand their influence or protect their meager holdings, frequently engaged in constant skirmishes with their neighbors, turning the land into a patchwork of localized warfare. For the common person, this meant living in an unpredictable landscape where allegiances could change overnight and the peace of one's village could be shattered by the sudden arbitrary decision of a nearby lord to settle a score or seize a piece of land. The concept of a universally applied rule of law, a system where justice was meted out fairly and consistently, largely evaporated. Instead, law became a deeply personal affair, often dependent on the whim and power of the local lord. There were no impartial courts, no clear legal codes that protected the average individual. Justice, if it could be called that, was swift, often brutal, and profoundly arbitrary. Imagine being accused of a crime, perhaps falsely, with no real means to defend yourself, your fate resting entirely in the hands of a powerful individual whose judgment might be swayed by personal grudges, local politics, or simple economic gain. The feeling of being utterly at the mercy of such localized, unchecked power must have been a constant, gnawing anxiety, a deep current of fear beneath the surface of daily life. This fragmentation of authority also gave rise to another pervasive danger: widespread banditry and lawlessness. With no overarching government to maintain roads, patrol borders, or enforce order, the vast, overgrown forests and isolated stretches of land became havens for bands of desperate individuals eager to prey upon the vulnerable. Travel, already arduous and infrequent, became even more perilous, transforming every journey, no matter how short, into a potentially life-threatening endeavor. Imagine needing to visit a neighboring village, perhaps to trade for essential supplies or seek news, and knowing that every step through the winding paths carried the risk of encountering armed brigands who could rob you of your few possessions, or worse, inflict violence without consequence. The simple act of moving from one place to another was fraught with a profound, quiet danger, adding yet another layer to the immense insecurity of the era. For the ordinary farmer, the village craftsman, or the humble serf, the absence of effective state protection meant a constant need for self-defense, or more commonly, a reluctant reliance on the nearest strongman. Without a standing army to ensure their safety, communities were largely left to their own devices. They might band together to form local militias, arming themselves with crude spears or agricultural tools, but these efforts were often no match for organized raiders or the professional retinues of rival lords. More often, survival depended on pledging allegiance and labor to a powerful local lord in exchange for his protection. This was a Faustian bargain. You gained a protector, but at the cost of your freedom, your labor, and often your autonomy. Imagine dedicating your entire life to working another man's land, knowing that your safety and the safety of your family was entirely contingent on his ability and willingness to defend you, and his potentially arbitrary decisions regarding your life. The system of fragmented power and localized violence created a deeply insecure existence for the average person. The very act of cultivating a field, raising livestock, or building a home was undertaken with a quiet, underlying awareness that it could all be taken away in a moment by a passing band of brigands, a rival lord's aggression, or a swift, brutal skirmish between local factions. The lines between protector and oppressor were often blurred. The very lord who offered protection could also be the source of arbitrary demands, heavy taxation, or brutal punishments. There was little respite, little guarantee of long-term peace. Life was a constant negotiation with immediate threats, a day-by-day struggle to maintain what little one had, always under the menacing shadow of the sword, whether wielded by a foreign invader or a local power. This pervasive atmosphere of internal conflict and lawlessness profoundly shaped the mental landscape of the time. Trust was a precious and fragile commodity, rarely extended beyond the immediate family or closest community. Suspicion of outsiders was high, and a deep sense of cynicism about justice and fairness would have been common. Imagine living in a world where the very structures meant to protect you were often the ones inflicting harm, where the concept of fairness was a distant, often unreachable ideal, and where personal safety was a luxury rarely afforded. The weight of this systemic insecurity, this constant threat from within, was a heavy burden, demanding an immense, quiet resilience from those who simply sought to live out their lives. As we gently absorb these images of a world fractured by internal strife and the constant presence of localized violence, let us remember the quiet strength required to navigate such perilous times. The shadow of the sword, whether cast by external forces or by the breakdown of internal order, was a defining characteristic of this difficult era, demanding constant vigilance and an unwavering will to endure. This profound insecurity, this relentless dance with the possibility of sudden violence, continues to deepen our understanding of why existence during the Dark Ages was such a challenging and often brutal experience, as we slowly drift towards contemplating the intricate chains of social order that bound its people. As the anxieties of external raids and the ever-present threat of local skirmishes slowly begin to quiet in our minds, let us now gently shift our gaze to the very foundation of society during the Dark Ages, the intricate, unyielding system of feudalism. This was not merely a political arrangement. It was the very air people breathed, a rigid framework that dictated virtually every aspect of life, profoundly limiting individual freedom and opportunity, and ensuring that, for the vast majority, existence was bound by the chains of earth. Imagine a ladder firmly rooted in the ground with very few rungs, and almost no possibility of climbing it. This was the social hierarchy of the era. At the very top stood a king, often with limited actual power beyond his immediate domain, reliant on the loyalty of his powerful nobles. Below him were these great lords, the counts and dukes, who controlled vast tracts of land, and beneath them, the knights, offering military service in exchange for smaller landholdings. But at the very bottom, forming the immense foundational base of this social pyramid, were the common people, the peasants, the farmers, and most crucially, the serfs. For these countless souls, their birth was not just a beginning, but a lifelong sentence. A trajectory that allowed for almost no deviation, no escape. What did it mean to be a serf in the Dark Ages? It meant being tied to the land. You were not a slave in the classical sense, bought and sold like property, but your life, your labor, and the lives of your children were inextricably linked to the plot of ground you worked. You could not simply pack up your meager belongings and leave. Your Lord owned the land, and in many ways he owned your right to live and work upon it. Your entire existence revolved around that patch of soil, its fertility, its yields, its struggles. Picture the daily obligations. Your days, from before dawn until after dusk, were not truly your own. A significant portion of your time and effort was dedicated to working the Lord's domain, his personal fields, his forests, his mills. This was your rent, paid not in coin, which was scarce, but in sweat and muscle. Imagine the backbreaking labor, plowing, sowing, harvesting, clearing forests, repairing fences, all for someone else's benefit, before you could even turn your attention to the small, often less fertile, strips of land allocated for your own family's sustenance. Your work for the Lord was always paramount, always came first, leaving you with little energy or daylight for your own needs. Beyond labor, you were subject to various taxes, often paid in kind. A portion of your grain, a certain number of chickens or eggs, a percentage of your wine or beer, all would be collected by the Lord's reeve. Even the simple act of grinding your grain into flour or baking your bread in the communal oven required paying a fee to the Lord, for he owned the mill and the oven. This meant that a substantial part of your hard-won produce, the very food that you had toiled for, was systematically siphoned away, leaving you with barely enough to survive, and certainly no surplus to accumulate wealth or improve your station. The economic realities of serfdom were harsh and unforgiving. There was no real concept of personal wealth or financial independence for the serf. Any surplus you managed to generate was often quickly absorbed by obligations to the Lord or by the sheer necessity of survival in a lean year. Innovation was often discouraged, as any increased productivity would simply lead to higher demands from the Lord. This created a profound disincentive for progress, locking communities into cycles of subsistence farming and economic stagnation. There was little hope for advancement, little opportunity to invest in a better future, as the fruits of your labor were never truly your own. Your rights were incredibly limited. You had no say in the laws that governed you, no voice in the decisions that shaped your community. Your Lord was judge, jury, and often executioner for disputes within his domain. To challenge his authority was to risk everything. You could not marry without his permission. You could not leave the land. And your children would inherit the same status, bound by the same chains of earth as you were. Imagine the weight of knowing that your entire lineage, stretching into an indefinite future, was destined to repeat the same cycle of toil and subservience with almost no hope of escape. This profound lack of personal freedom and social mobility was a defining characteristic of life for the vast majority in the Dark Ages. The idea that one could, through hard work and talent, rise above their birth status was largely a concept for the distant future, an alien dream. You were born into a station, and there you remained, often until death. Your identity was intertwined with your Lord, your village, and the land you worked, leaving little room for individual aspirations beyond the immediate necessities of survival. This system, while offering a semblance of order and protection in a chaotic world, exacted an immense price in human liberty and potential, binding generations to a relentless cycle of duty and limited opportunity. Let us allow this somber understanding of feudal bonds and the daily life of a serf to gently settle as we prepare to explore the crude and often brutal forms of justice that upheld this rigid social order, further reinforcing the deep constraints on personal freedom in this distant, challenging era. As we consider the deeply rooted chains of earth that bound the serf to the land, we must also turn our thoughts to the very mechanisms that enforce this rigid social order, the rudimentary and often brutally arbitrary forms of justice that characterize the Dark Ages. This was not a legal system based on codified laws, meticulous evidence, or the impartial judgment we strive for today. Instead, it was a terrifyingly localized, often superstitious, and profoundly personal affair, where the power of the Lord reigned supreme, and the concept of due process was virtually non-existent. Imagine for a moment being accused of an offense in such a world. There were no public defenders, no presumption of innocence until proven guilty, no meticulously recorded court proceedings. Instead, your fate would likely rest in the hands of your local lord or his appointed reeve, a man whose judgment could be swayed by personal allegiances, local feuds, or even simple whims. The laws themselves were often unwritten, based on ancient customs or the Lord's decree, making them opaque and inconsistent. The common person had little understanding of their legal standing, and even less power to appeal a decision that might be profoundly unfair or unjust. The very air of the Lord's hall, where such justice was dispensed, would have been thick with unspoken fear and the heavy weight of absolute authority. leaving little room for a true defense or genuine mercy. The most striking and perhaps most chilling aspect of Dark Age justice was the pervasive role of superstition and the divine. When human evidence was scarce, or when the truth remained elusive, the accused might be subjected to a trial by ordeal. These were not legal processes designed to uncover facts, but rather desperate appeals to divine judgment, a fervent belief that God or the supernatural forces would somehow, miraculously, reveal guilt or innocence through extraordinary, often excruciating means. Picture yourself undergoing a cold water ordeal, where you would be bound, perhaps with hands and feet tied, and then thrown into a consecrated body of water, often a lake or a river. If you floated, you were deemed guilty, for the pure water was believed to have rejected you, spitting out your sin. If you sank, you were considered innocent, for the water had embraced you, accepting your purity. Yet, tragically, by the time your innocence was proven by sinking, you would often already be dead or gravely near it, drowned in the very act of seeking divine vindication. Even more terrifying were the hot water ordeal, or the ordeal by iron. Imagine the agonizing prospect of plunging your bare hand into a cauldron of boiling water, or grasping a red-hot iron bar, often carried for a set number of paces. Immediately after, the wound would be tightly bandaged and sealed. After a set number of days, typically 3, the bandages would be removed, and the wound inspected by the Lord or a priest. If it was healing cleanly, miraculously uninfected, you were declared innocent. If it festered, became inflamed, or showed signs of severe infection, you were deemed guilty, for God had not intervened to protect you from harm. In an era without germ theory, without proper wound care or sterile environments, the chances of any deep burn or scald healing cleanly were incredibly slim, almost guaranteeing a guilty verdict, regardless of actual culpability. These were not objective tests of truth, but brutal, agonizing tests of endurance and blind faith, often designed more to extract confessions through sheer terror or to ritually condemn the accused, thereby reinforcing the Lord's unquestionable power and the perceived unyielding will of God and the cosmos. The consequences for those deemed guilty, or simply those who fell out of favor, were relentlessly harsh, designed to be swift, visible, and deeply deterrent. Punishments were almost invariably public, intended to serve as stark warnings to the entire community and to reinforce the Lord's absolute authority over life and limb, underscoring the profound fragility of existence. Minor infractions, such as poaching in the Lord's precious forest to feed a starving family, or the petty theft of a few eggs from the Lord's poultry, could result in severe, agonizing beatings. More serious offenses might lead to horrific mutilation, the loss of a hand to prevent further theft, or the cutting out of a tongue for perceived slander, or the removal of an eye for bearing false witness. Branding, a permanent, searing mark of shame burned into the skin, was also a common punishment, ensuring that the transgressor carried their condemnation visibly for the rest of their often short lives. Imprisonment, as we know it today, a controlled environment for rehabilitation or long-term detention, was a rare and often impractical concept. Jails were typically rudimentary, cold, and unsanitary dungeons, used primarily for holding suspects before trial or for high-status individuals awaiting ransom. For the common person, a sentence rarely meant confinement for years. Instead, it almost always led to immediate physical pain, public humiliation, banishment from the community, or, most terrifyingly, execution. Executions themselves were often brutal spectacles, carried out by hanging from the village gallows, by beheading with a crude axe, or through other agonizing methods designed to inflict maximum terror and suffering. These public displays served as grim deterrents for a population living under constant fear, a visceral reminder of the ultimate power of the Lord and the ever-present threat of a swift, brutal end. There was no concept of rehabilitation, no thought of a second chance, no restorative justice for those who transgressed. The emphasis was on immediate visible punishment, a swift and often irreversible demonstration of power designed to maintain order through absolute terror and submission. Imagine the constant gnawing anxiety of navigating such a system where a single misstep, a false accusation based on rumor or personal animosity, or simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time, could lead to such devastating and life-altering consequences. You could be stripped not only of your meager possessions and your hard-won freedom, but potentially of your very life or your bodily integrity, leaving your family destitute and grieving. This pervasive fear of arbitrary justice, this quiet dread of the Lord's wrath or the perceived judgment of God, profoundly shaped daily interactions and instilled a deep-seated caution in every villager. This stark contrast with our modern legal systems is profound, highlighting the immense progress humanity has made in establishing fair and equitable forms of justice. Today, we expect detailed investigations, the right to legal representation, the presentation of objective evidence, and judgments based on reason, established law, and the principles of human rights. In the Dark Ages, the process was often opaque, driven primarily by localized power dynamics, personal biases, and deeply ingrained superstition, with little regard for what we would now consider fundamental human dignity. This fundamental lack of true justice, this arbitrary application of coercive power, added another immense layer to the pervasive sense of insecurity and vulnerability that defined daily existence. It meant that even within the supposed safety of your own community, surrounded by familiar faces, the threat of legal repercussions, often cruel and utterly unjust, was a quiet, ever-present fear, reinforcing the limited agency and profound helplessness of the common person in this distant, challenging era. It forced a continuous internal calculation of risks, a silent understanding that survival often meant strict obedience, and a constant, wary awareness of the Lord's watchful eye. As these somber reflections on the crude and often brutal forms of justice in the Dark Ages gently settle in your mind, let us allow ourselves to drift further into the intricate mental landscape of this era, where not only earthly lords, but also powerful, unseen spiritual forces shape the daily decisions and emotional states of its people. We prepare now to explore the deeply intertwined world of faith and pervasive fear that permeated every aspect of life, guiding choices and providing a fragile comfort amidst unrelenting hardship. As these somber reflections on the crude and often brutal forms of justice in the Dark Ages gently settle in your mind, let us allow ourselves to drift further into the intricate mental landscape of this era, where not only earthly lords, but also powerful, unseen spiritual forces shape the daily decisions and emotional states of its people. We prepare now to explore the deeply intertwined world of faith and pervasive fear that permeated every aspect of life, guiding choices and providing a fragile comfort amidst unrelenting hardship. Imagine a world where the vast expanse of the unknown far outweighed the realms of the scientifically understood. For the people of the Dark Ages, their inner lives, their very thoughts and feelings were deeply, inextricably woven with the threads of both profound religious faith and pervasive, often terrifying superstition. Christianity, the dominant religion, was far more than a set of beliefs. It was the central pillar of society, often the only stable institution in a world fragmented by chaos and violence. The church was the provider of solace, the keeper of knowledge, the architect of morality, and the guiding force through life's most profound moments from birth to death. It offered a framework for understanding an otherwise incomprehensible world, a promise of salvation amidst earthly suffering, and a powerful sense of community and shared purpose. Yet, alongside the formal doctrines of the church, an older, deeper current of belief flowed, shaping daily decisions and emotional states. The world of pervasive superstition, magic, omens, malevolent spirits, and the power of curses were not dismissed as folklore, but were very real, tangible forces believed to influence every aspect of existence. A sudden storm might be seen as divine wrath or the work of a demon. A failed crop could be attributed to an evil eye cast by a jealous neighbor. Illness was not merely a physical affliction, but often a spiritual battle, a sign of sin, or the consequence of dark magic. Imagine living in such a landscape, where every unexplained event, every unusual occurrence, carried with it a profound spiritual implication, demanding constant vigilance and a desperate search for meaning or protection. This intertwining of faith and fear deeply shaped daily decisions. Before setting out on a journey, a blessing might be sought, or a specific prayer recited to ward off evil. When planting crops, rituals might be performed to appease unseen forces and ensure a bountiful harvest. A person suffering from a fever might seek not only herbal remedies, but also a holy relic to touch, or an incantation to be whispered over them, believing that both earthly and spiritual interventions were equally vital. Every significant life event, every small choice, was filtered through this lens of spiritual significance, creating a constant, low-level anxiety about one's standing with God and the unseen powers that governed the world. For the vast majority, education beyond the practical skills for survival was a distant luxury. Illiteracy was widespread, and the preservation of knowledge became a sacred duty, largely confined to the quiet, secluded walls of monasteries. Here, devoted monks meticulously copied ancient texts, preserving fragments of classical learning and Christian doctrine for future generations. These monasteries served as beacons of intellectual light, but their knowledge remained largely inaccessible to the common person. The broader intellectual growth of society was slow, often stagnant, as the infrastructure, patronage, and widespread access to education that once fueled Roman intellectualism had vanished. This limited understanding of the natural world meant that explanations for disease, weather patterns, and celestial events were almost always spiritual or supernatural, further entrenching the power of both faith and fear. This created a profound psychological impact. Imagine the constant burden of living in a world perceived as being in a perpetual, titanic battle between spiritual forces of good and evil, with your own soul as the ultimate prize. The fear of hell, of divine punishment for sins, of succumbing to temptation was a constant gnawing presence. The church offered comfort through confession, penance, and the promise of heaven, providing a structured path to redemption. But it also reinforced the very fears it sought to alleviate, making salvation a demanding, often terrifying journey. This delicate balance between solace and dread shaped emotional states, creating a mental landscape where quiet desperation and fervent hope often coexisted. Your understanding of the universe and your place within it would have been entirely different from our own. Without the lens of science, the world was alive with spiritual presence, saints and angels, demons and spirits, all interacting with the physical realm. The rustling of leaves could be an omen, the flight of a bird a sign, a sudden illness, a direct message from the divine. This pervasive worldview meant that there was little room for casual skepticism or scientific inquiry. Belief was paramount, and the consequences of disbelief were often perceived as dire, both in this life and the next. This constant engagement with the unseen, this continuous weighing of spiritual implications in every action, created a deep, rich, yet often burdensome internal world for the people of the Dark Ages. So, as we reflect on this deeply spiritual and often fear-laden mental landscape, allow these quiet contemplations to gently settle. It reveals a profound inner resilience, a continuous search for meaning and comfort in an otherwise chaotic and challenging existence. The intertwining of religion and superstition provided both profound guidance and immense psychological pressure, forming an integral part of understanding why life in this distant era was such a unique and demanding experience. As we now gently prepare to examine the material culture, the simple tools, and the lack of modern comforts that further define this slow grind of existence, we have journeyed together through the challenging landscape of the Dark Ages, peeling back the layers of romanticized myth to reveal the stark, quiet truth of human existence. It was a time defined not by grand narratives of heroes and legends, but by the deeply personal, unwavering struggle for mere survival, a testament to the quiet, immense fortitude of the human spirit. We've seen how the fading light of the Roman Empire ushered in a period of pervasive instability, where once great cities crumbled and central authority fragmented, leaving communities isolated and vulnerable. We contemplated the constant, gnawing hunger, the back-breaking labor in meager fields, and the ever-present specter of famine that made every harvest a desperate gamble. We pictured the humble, often unsanitary mud and wattle huts, offering little respite from the biting cold and damp, and the coarse clothing that provided only basic protection against the relentless elements. We immersed ourselves in a world where disease was a pervasive, invisible enemy, where a simple fever could be a death sentence, and where devastating plagues could sweep through, shattering communities and leaving behind profound psychological trauma. We understood the constant shadow of the sword, both from external invaders like the swift and brutal Vikings, and from the internal conflicts of petty lords and the ever-present threat of banditry. This was a time where safety was a luxury and reliance on local strongmen came at the cost of personal freedom. We delved into the rigid chains of earth, the feudal system that tied the vast majority to the land, their lives dictated by the whims of their lords, their labor perpetually owed, and their rights incredibly limited. We encountered the brutal, arbitrary forms of justice, where trials by ordeal and severe punishments were a terrifying reality, leaving little room for true fairness or mercy. And finally, we explored the rich, yet often burdensome, mental landscape shaped by the intertwining forces of faith and pervasive superstition, where the unseen world held immense power over daily decisions and emotional states, and education was a guarded treasure within monastic walls. Through all these hardships, through the relentless toil, the constant fear, and the profound uncertainty, we glimpse not just suffering, but an extraordinary quiet resilience. The people of the Dark Ages endured, finding moments of community, of faith, and simple human connection amidst overwhelming odds. Their story, in its unvarnished truth, offers us a profound perspective. As we gently draw this journey to a close, take a moment to reflect on the quiet comforts that surround you now. The warmth of your home, The ready availability of food and clean water, the protection of law, and the wonders of modern medicine, these are the fruits of centuries of slow, often painful progress. Understanding the challenges of the Dark Ages deepens our appreciation for the advancements we often take for granted. If this journey through history has given you a new perspective, a quiet sense of gratitude for your own time, consider sharing it. Your simple act of sharing this video can bring this calming historical reflection to someone else who might appreciate this unique perspective tonight. And if you found solace in these stories, if you've enjoyed this immersive exploration, quietly join our community by subscribing. It's a gentle way to stay connected, to continue exploring fascinating histories, and to find peace in shared knowledge. Tonight, as the echoes of the Dark Ages softly fade, carry with you this understanding of enduring human spirit. Let the quiet appreciation for your own world gently settle upon you. Find rest in the stillness, a profound rest earned through the contemplation of distant struggles. Allow the ambient sounds to guide you further into peaceful slumber. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until our next quiet exploration, may your night be filled with deep, restorative peace.